There are moments when nothing is happening, and yet your mind refuses to slow down. You're not in danger, you're not under pressure, there's nothing immediate that needs your attention, but your thoughts keep moving. One leads into another, then another, and before you notice it, your mind is active again, even in silence. It doesn't feel like you chose it, it feels automatic. Like your brain doesn't recognize that it can stop. You might try to distract yourself, shift your attention, or focus on something else, but the moment that focus fades, the thinking returns, and it feels like something is keeping it going, even when there's no clear reason for it. At first, it seems like normal thinking, just processing things, reflecting, going over your day. But then it continues longer than it should. It doesn't settle. It doesn't reach a point where it naturally stops. And that's when it begins to feel like something else entirely. Because what you're experiencing isn't just thinking. It's a pattern your brain has learned to maintain, even when there's nothing left to think about. Your brain is constantly trying to predict, prepare, and understand. That's what it's designed to do. It looks for patterns, scans for potential problems, and tries to stay one step ahead of anything that might happen. And most of the time, this happens in the background, without you noticing. But when that system becomes too active, it stops turning off. It keeps scanning even when there's nothing to find. It keeps analyzing even when there's nothing to solve. And because of that, your mind stays engaged, even in situations where it doesn't need to be. This is why relaxing can feel difficult, because your brain doesn't see relaxation as a priority. It sees activity as useful. It sees thinking as preparation. And it assumes that staying active is better than switching off. So instead of slowing down, it keeps going. It moves from one thought to another, not because it needs to, but because it has learned that this is what it's supposed to do. There's also a subtle discomfort that appears when your mind starts to slow down. A quiet moment doesn't always feel calm. Sometimes it feels empty, unfamiliar, or slightly uneasy, and your brain reacts to that. It fills the space. It brings up thoughts, questions, memories, anything to keep the activity going. Because activity feels normal, it feels controlled. And stillness, even when it's safe, can feel like something is missing. So instead of allowing the quiet to settle, your mind replaces it with thinking. It gives itself something to do, something to focus on, and that focus creates the feeling of movement, even when nothing is actually happening. Over time, this becomes a habit. Your brain learns that whenever there's space, it should be filled. And that's why, even when everything is calm, your mind doesn't stay that way for long. The more this pattern repeats, the more natural it begins to feel. Constant thinking starts to feel like your default state. It becomes something you don't question, something that feels like it's just part of how your mind works. And because it feels normal, you don't immediately recognize it as something that's been reinforced. You don't see how often your brain returns to activity, even when it's unnecessary. You just experience it as something that happens automatically. But that automatic feeling is built over time. Each moment of continued thinking, each time your brain fills silence with activity, it strengthens the pattern. It makes it easier for your mind to stay active the next time there's space. And eventually, the idea of your mind being still starts to feel unfamiliar, even though it's something your brain is fully capable of. As this pattern builds, your brain begins to treat constant activity as the baseline, not as something unusual, but as something expected. So when there's a moment where nothing is happening, instead of recognizing it as an opportunity to rest, your mind treats it as something that needs to be filled. That's when thoughts start appearing again. Not because they're necessary, but because your brain has learned that empty space should be replaced. And the more often this happens, the faster it becomes. The gap between silence and thinking gets shorter, until eventually there is almost no gap at all. You might notice this in small ways. The moment you wake up, your mind is already active. When you sit down with nothing to do, thoughts start forming almost immediately. And even when you try to relax, there's a background layer of thinking that doesn't fully disappear. This isn't because your brain is unable to relax. It's because it has been trained to stay active. And once that pattern is strong enough, it continues automatically, without needing a clear reason to start. There's also a deeper layer connected to control. Thinking gives your brain the sense that it's doing something, that it's managing what's happening internally. Even if the thoughts aren't useful, they still create the feeling of engagement, and that engagement feels safer than doing nothing, because doing nothing can feel uncertain. It can feel like letting go of control, and your brain isn't comfortable with that. It prefers to stay active, to keep processing, to keep scanning for something it can work on. So instead of allowing stillness, it replaces it with thought. It keeps itself occupied, even when there's nothing that needs to be solved. And over time, this becomes the default response to any moment of quiet. What makes this difficult is that it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like normal thinking. But underneath it, there's a constant attempt to maintain control, even in situations where control isn't necessary. Another reason your brain won't relax is because it has learned to associate thinking with importance. The more often you engage with thoughts, the more your brain assumes they matter. It doesn't evaluate them based on usefulness, it evaluates them based on how much attention you give them. So if you consistently return to certain thoughts, your brain strengthens them. If you consistently return to continue, those thoughts begin to dominate your attention, not because they're important, but because they've been reinforced. This creates a cycle where thinking leads to more thinking. The more active your mind is, the more your brain assumes it should stay that way, and because of that, it becomes harder to step out of the pattern. It's not that your brain is forcing you to think. It's that it has learned that thinking is something you consistently engage with, so it keeps providing it. What makes this pattern even stronger is that it often feels productive, even when it isn't. Your brain creates the sense that thinking is helping, that it's moving you toward something, even if that something isn't clearly defined. You might feel like you're preparing, organizing, or understanding things more deeply. And that feeling makes it difficult to step away, because it feels like stopping would mean losing something valuable. But most of the time, the thoughts aren't leading anywhere. They're repeating, shifting slightly, but staying within the same structure. And the sense of progress is what keeps you engaged, even when nothing is actually changing. This is why your brain doesn't relax, because it believes the activity is useful, and as long as it believes that, it continues, even when there's no real benefit to staying in that state. If you observe this pattern closely, you'll notice that your mind doesn't actually need a strong reason to stay active. It doesn't wait for something important to happen. It simply continues what it has already learned to do. And once that pattern is established, it doesn't rely on triggers in the same way anymore. A quiet moment is enough, a pause in activity, a break in focus, even a brief moment where nothing is demanding your attention, and almost immediately your brain fills that space. It returns to familiar thoughts, familiar patterns, familiar loops. This is why it can feel like your mind is always on. Not because there's always something to think about, but because the system that generates thoughts has been reinforced to keep running. It doesn't need a reason anymore. It only needs space. And the more often this happens, the more automatic it becomes. The thought appears, you engage with it, and the loop continues. Not because it has to, but because it has been practiced enough to feel natural. Your brain also doesn't distinguish between helpful activity and unnecessary activity in the way you might expect. It simply tracks what you do most often, and if you spend a lot of time thinking, analyzing, or mentally revisiting things, it assumes that this is something you value. So it adjusts accordingly. It makes thinking more accessible. It makes it easier to return to. It strengthens the pathways that lead to those patterns until they become your default. This is why it can feel like your mind is working against you, like it won't stop even when you want it to. But it's not resisting you, it's following what it has learned, it's repeating what has been reinforced. And the more consistent that reinforcement has been, the more persistent the pattern becomes, not because it's necessary, but because it has become familiar. There's also an emotional component that keeps this pattern active. When your mind is constantly engaged, it creates a subtle sense of tension. Not always strong enough to notice immediately, but present enough to keep your attention involved. That tension makes the thinking feel relevant. It gives it a sense of urgency even when there's nothing urgent happening. And because of that, it becomes harder to step away from it. Over time, that tension becomes associated with the pattern itself. It's no longer tied to a specific thought, but to the act of thinking continuously, and that makes it feel like something you need to stay inside, something that requires your attention. But that feeling isn't coming from the situation, it's coming from the repetition. From the fact that your mind has been in this state for long enough that it now feels normal. At a certain point, constant thinking starts to feel like something you can't control. It becomes automatic, something that happens without your input. And when it feels that way, it's easy to assume that it's just how your brain works. But even in that state, there is still a moment where the pattern begins, a point where the thought appears before you fully engage with it, and that moment, even if it's brief, is where the pattern can begin to shift, not by stopping the thought, but by not continuing it, by noticing it without building on it. And that's different from what your brain expects because it has learned to follow every thought it produces. So when you don't engage, it feels unfamiliar. It feels like something is missing. But that feeling is just the pattern being interrupted. And over time, that interruption is what allows your mind to begin slowing down again. One of the biggest reasons your brain won't relax is because it has learned to associate stillness with something unfamiliar. When your mind slows down, it doesn't immediately feel calm. Sometimes it feels empty, almost like something is missing, and your brain reacts to that absence by filling it again. It brings in thoughts not because they are needed, but because they create activity, and activity feels normal. It feels like something is happening, something is being processed, something is being managed. That feeling replaces the discomfort of stillness, even if the thoughts themselves don't lead anywhere. Over time, this creates a pattern where your brain avoids quiet by default. Not consciously, but automatically. The moment there is space, it fills it. The moment things slow down, it speeds them back up. And because this happens so consistently, stillness begins to feel unnatural, even though it's something your mind is fully capable of experiencing. The mistake is assuming that relaxing means stopping your thoughts completely, that if your mind is still active, then you're not relaxed. But your brain doesn't work like an on-off switch. It doesn't instantly go from activity to silence. Instead, it gradually slows down when it's not being reinforced. And that's the key difference. The reason your mind stays active isn't because it can't slow down. It's because it keeps being given a reason to continue. Every time you follow a thought, analyze it, or build on it, you're extending the activity. You're keeping the system running. And over time, that becomes the default state your brain returns to. So the shift doesn't come from forcing your mind to stop. It comes from allowing it to slow down naturally by not continuing every thought that appears. When you begin to notice this pattern clearly, something changes in how you experience it. The thoughts are still there, but they don't feel as controlling. They don't automatically pull you in the same way because you start to recognize what's happening as it begins. You notice the moment a thought appears. You notice the urge to follow it, and instead of automatically continuing it, there's a pause, a brief space where you don't add anything to it. That space is small, but it matters because it interrupts the pattern your brain has been repeating. It shows your mind that it doesn't have to follow every thought it produces, and the more often that happens, the more your brain begins to adjust. It starts to rely less on constant activity because the pattern is no longer being reinforced in the same way. As that shift continues, your mind begins to feel different in a way that's subtle at first. The thoughts don't disappear completely, but they lose their intensity. They don't carry the same urgency, the same pull, the same need to be followed. They appear, but they pass more easily. They don't expand into long chains of thinking. They don't build into loops. And in that space, you experience something closer to what relaxation actually is. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of constant engagement, the ability for thoughts to come and go without needing your attention every time they appear. And once that becomes familiar, the pattern that once kept your mind constantly active starts to weaken, not because you forced it to stop, but because you stopped giving it what it needed to continue. There's also a point where constant thinking starts to feel like something you rely on. Not because it helps, but because it's familiar. Your mind being active becomes your normal state, and anything different from that feels unusual. So even when there's nothing to think about, your brain continues, simply because stopping would feel unfamiliar. This creates a subtle dependency on mental activity. The presence of thoughts feels grounding, even when those thoughts aren't useful. They give you something to focus on, something to engage with, something that feels like movement. And without that movement, there's a sense of uncertainty. So your brain fills that space again. It returns to thinking not because it needs to, but because it's what it's used to. And the more this happens, the stronger that reliance becomes. The idea of your mind being quiet starts to feel distant, even though it's something that hasn't actually disappeared. It's still there. It's just being covered by a pattern that has been reinforced over time. There's also a tendency for your brain to revisit thoughts that feel unresolved emotionally, even if they don't require any further thinking. If something left even a small emotional impression, your mind treats it like something worth returning to, not because it needs to be solved, but because it created a reaction. And your brain uses that reaction as a signal. It assumes that anything that produced a feeling must matter in some way. So it keeps it active, it replays it, examines it, brings it back into focus. And each time it does that, it strengthens the connection between the thought and the feeling. The thought feels more significant, more relevant, more difficult to ignore. But that significance is being created through repetition. The more you revisit it, the more it feels like something important, even if nothing new is being added to it. If you look closely, you'll notice that your mind rarely stops on its own when it has been trained to stay active. It doesn't reach a natural end point, because it's not working toward one. It's simply continuing a pattern. That's why it can feel like your thoughts just keep going, without a clear direction. One leads to another, then another, not because they're connected in a meaningful way, but because your brain is maintaining activity. And that activity becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't need a goal. It doesn't need a conclusion. It only needs continuation. And as long as you engage with it, it continues. This is why relaxing doesn't happen automatically, because the system that keeps your mind active doesn't stop itself. It only slows down when it's no longer being reinforced. What ultimately allows your mind to relax isn't forcing it to become quiet, but changing how you relate to the activity itself. Instead of treating every thought as something that needs your attention, you begin to see them as something that can exist without your involvement. That shift removes the pressure to engage. It removes the idea that you need to follow every thought, understand every detail, or resolve everything that appears in your mind. And when that pressure is gone, the pattern begins to change. Thoughts still appear, but they don't carry the same weight. They don't pull you in the same way. They don't continue automatically. They rise and then they pass. And over time, that becomes the new pattern. Not constant activity, but natural movement. And in that movement, your mind finally begins to slow down in a way that feels effortless.